In early 2006, a 30-year-old woman in Tallahassee was 4 months pregnant and navigating a tricky time in her life. Cautiously optimistic about welcoming her rainbow baby, she was also going through some personal troubles. Her and her husband had been separated for a few months, and she was casually seeing another man, whom she was breaking things off with to work on her marriage and prepare for the arrival of the baby. After a regular day of working her 9-to-5 office job, followed by her side gig at a grocery store bakery, she headed home to get off her feet. That was the last anyone saw her. Even though she was normally in touch with friends, family, and coworkers every single day, a series of events led to her not being reported missing for a few days. The investigation revealed persons of interest, clues around a late-night telephone call, and a missed counseling appointment. All of these things paved the way for theories. Finally, 15 years after her disappearance, more of what happened that night came into light, but it still hasn't been enough to close the case. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week I'm bringing to you the unsolved disappearance of Allie Gilmore. Hi everyone, before I get into the case today, I just want to give a quick content warning that today's case does have discussion of miscarriage, pregnancy complications, and child loss. I also just want to give this quick legal disclosure before we begin. I want to note that this episode discusses individuals who have been publicly identified by law enforcement as persons of interest or potential suspects. Because of that, I use their real full names. The fact that someone is discussed in an investigation does not mean they committed a crime. Unless otherwise stated, no one mentioned in this episode has been convicted in connection with Allie Gilmore's disappearance, and all individuals are presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. So with that established, let's get into it. It's the early evening of Monday, February 6th, and Karen Freeman is concerned. Karen works for the Florida Department of Health and supervises a woman who is also her very close friend, 30-year-old Allie Gilmore. Allie hadn't shown up for work that Monday, which was very out of character for her. But what was even more concerning to Karen is that she found out Allie hadn't shown up to work on Friday either. She had actually spoken to Allie later in the evening on Thursday the 2nd, when Allie called her to discuss something she needed advice on. But Allie hadn't indicated at all that she would be absent on Friday. Unfortunately, Karen woke up sick on Friday and had to take the day off, so she didn't know about Allie's absence in real time. Her colleagues didn't know what to make of her absence Friday. Even though it wasn't like her not to call, she had mentioned to them that she would be in the office later that morning because she had a counseling appointment at 9. So initially they just thought that maybe it got bumped back or there was a reasonable explanation. When Karen arrived to work Monday and found out about Allie's absence, and then Allie didn't show up to work on Monday, she began trying to call Allie's home. But the phone just rang and rang with no answer. So she decided to head to Allie's house with another colleague, a woman named Liz Denson. The two pulled up to Allie's home at 231 Lorraine Court, a modest home tucked into a quiet neighborhood on the southeast side of Tallahassee. The area was made up of residential streets and single-family homes. Allie's street was part of a cul-de-sac, which was a perfect low-traffic street, great for raising kids. The southeast side of Tallahassee was a growing area in the early 2000s, attracting families, young professionals, and state employees looking for a little more space than they might find closer to downtown. It blended suburban neighborhoods with the natural landscape North Florida is known for. Tree-lined streets, patches of forest, and winding roads gave the area a distinctly different feel from the crowded coastal cities that often come to mind when people think of Florida. When they got to Allie's home, they noticed that her vehicle was in the driveway. They knocked at the door and on the front windows, but nobody came to answer. They noticed that Allie's bedroom light was on, as was her floodlight. Something felt eerie and off about the scene, so they decided to call police for a welfare check. That welfare check would soon follow with a missing persons report, because law enforcement would make entry and not find any sign of Allie. Her house looked tidy, no signs of a struggle, it wasn't ransacked, nothing looked like it was taken. The house had been locked up completely, except for a window that was left unlocked in the house's spare bedroom, on one side of the one-story home. Allie's car was in the driveway, and her purse was sitting inside of it. Inside the purse was a set of work keys. However, her car keys and her house keys were missing. They were nowhere in the house and not in the car. It would soon be established that the last time people saw and spoke to Allie happened on Thursday evening, February 3rd. Law enforcement needed to make contact with Allie's loved ones to make them aware of her disappearance. But to do so, they'd need to reach out all the way to the opposite end of the Sunshine State. This next part, where I get into her upbringing, I relied heavily on reporting from Stephen Price of the Tallahassee Democrat, and I'll have all sources linked in the show notes, but wanted to give him a shout out here. Allie Gilmore was born Allie Grimsley to her mother Lorvetta Grimsley and father Percy Walker Sr. on January 5, 1976. She was named after the famous heavyweight boxer Muhammad Ali. She never knew her father when she was growing up, and for the first decade of her life, Allie was raised by her mother's niece due to some issues going on in her mother's life at the time. She grew up 6 hours away from Tallahassee in Riviera Beach within the Palm Beach County community, which Stephen Price described as a community, quote, polarized by race and money, end quote. While the waterfront and nearby coastal communities like Singer Island were home to some of the area's wealthiest residents, many neighborhoods within Riviera Beach itself faced persistent poverty and disinvestment. The divide was often described not only in terms of money, but race as well, with many of the affluent coastal areas being predominantly white and much of Riviera Beach's population being black. When Allie turned 11, her mom was positioned to take her back and apparently ran a very strict household. It came from a place of love. She had to work so hard to keep a roof over their heads. She worked multiple jobs, and so she just had strict rules to try to get her kids on the right track. So the kids had to dress modestly, take school seriously, help around the house. They had to be home when the streetlights came on, and when they turned 18, they all had to register to vote. Allie's mother married Carl McLawrence, who stepped in as a fatherly role to Allie. She never did get a chance to meet her biological father because by the time she found out who he was at 10 years old, he had already died. Carl told Stephen Price that at one point when Allie was in high school, neighborhood gangs were attacking girls in the neighborhood, so he offered to walk her to the bus stop and wait with her. But he said Allie was just no nonsense. She'd give you a sweet smile, but she didn't put up with anything from anybody. Allie attended school outside of her neighborhood. She went to Jupiter High School, and to do so, she had to get up extra early to catch the bus, waking up at 5 a.m. to catch the bus while it was still dark out. She was a standout athlete who ran track, and that meant that sometimes she wouldn't get home until super late at night, so these were really long school days for her. After graduating from Jupiter High School, she decided to attend Florida A&M University, which is what brought her to Tallahassee. She loved the community there and decided to plant roots. Through college, she worked in the bakery at Publix and loved that job. After graduating with her degree in 1998 in health information management, she began working for the State Department of Health as a statistical analyst. She also kept her job at Publix as well, working in the bakery on occasional evenings and weekends. She was really social. She had a big social circle, both locally and back home. She kept in touch with her friends from the West Palm Beach area, particularly her close friend from high school, whom she had thrown her a baby shower and was even in her delivery room when she gave birth to her son. That friend had brought that story up because she said she planned the most over the top baby shower for her, and it was all coordinated and cute and themed. And this is, before Pinterest was even out there. Social media was newer. Actually, this particular friend had like an 8-year-old. So this was in the 90s when this baby was born. And so, no social media, nothing to get all these themed ideas like we do nowadays, but she just was naturally creative like that. Not only did Allie call friends and family often, she was also known to email and would send life updates and inspirational messages out almost every day to the people she loved. And she also cultivated a large friendship group in Tallahassee and was particularly close with her boss at the health department, Karen Freeman. A year after Allie graduated from college, she was at Governor Square Mall one night when she bumped into a cute guy selling picture frames from a booth. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm at the mall and I see people working at those kiosks, I just try not to make eye contact and keep it moving so they don't try to sell me something. If you know, you know. That's how I try to handle those. But she was actually on the lookout for a photo frame. She was looking for one for her graduation picture. And I'm sure seeing the handsome man who was working helped motivate her to maybe approach. The charismatic man at the kiosk was James Gilmore. She made a return visit a few days later, and he asked her for her phone number. The two began dating, and just 8 months later, James took her back to where they met at Governor Square Mall and got down on one knee to propose. She was very happy to say yes and start her life with James and everything their future entailed. James was a bit older than Allie, and he had already been married before and had 3 children of his own. James said that Allie took the role of being a stepmother just instantly. She was a natural with his kids. As we know, sometimes when you're blending families together, that can really impact relationship dynamics, but that was not the case. They had their share of problems, which I'll get into in a moment, but for the most part, it wasn't about his kids. She really cared about his kids. James and Allie were married in October of 2000. Allie wanted children, but wasn't in any immediate hurry. First, they purchased the home together on Lorraine Court. Much like how she planned a party, Allie coordinated every bit of the house. She planted flowers, made the yard beautiful, and picked out coordinating mailbox address stickers to kind of match the house, which is so cute. Then in summer of 2005, Allie was elated to find out she was pregnant. Right away, she began picking out baby clothes and planning for the baby. But within a month, she started experiencing bleeding, and her and James got the heartbreaking news that she was suffering a miscarriage. This took its toll on the couple, who were already beginning to have some issues in their marriage. From the perspective of James, he said they just were having generalized strains in the marriage, they weren't communicating well, and that he felt they weren't spending enough time together. Allie had confided in friends that she was feeling financial constraints and was sick of having to work a second job. This was made more difficult by the fact that she definitely out-earned him, and then on top of it, he was having to pay a lot of child support to his ex. Which, that's a factor. That's just how it goes. If you have kids with someone and they have primary custody for the most part, you're going to be paying a lot of child support, but that absolutely can put a strain on a relationship. So when I say their fights weren't about the children, she adored his children. It was just the financial constraints that she was feeling and having to carry all the weight of the money in the household. Things boiled over later that fall in November, and James moved out of the home. Just 2 days after he left, Allie found out she was pregnant again. We're going to revisit the social and personal dynamics in Allie's life again in a moment, but first, I want to pick back up to the physical search for her after she was reported missing on Monday evening, February 6th, 2006. Now, right away, police labeled the disappearance as suspicious, and they took it seriously. They began canvassing and speaking to neighbors as well as friends and family who had recently spoken with Allie. They also began searching around the immediate neighborhood and beyond. Unfortunately, starting with the evening Allie left work on Thursday, all the way through Saturday, there had been severe thunderstorms in the area that were accompanied by heavy rainfall. This made bringing scent tracking dogs in very difficult. Because the neighborhood was relatively new and new homes were still being built, searches were conducted around any construction areas and they looked for fresh dirt and things like that as well. But no luck. Nobody in the neighborhood reported hearing any screaming, commotion, or witnessing anything alarming. As I said before, the house was not in disarray, but the Tallahassee Police Department did bring in the forensics unit just to cover their bases and look for any evidence that may not be caught with the naked eye. As physical searches continued, 9 family members came up to the Tallahassee area, and most of them decided to stay without a predetermined endpoint. They just had to stick around and find Allie. You guys, I know it's the case with every family with these cases, but when I tell you just the outpouring of emotion and what they shared about Allie in these newspaper articles, in the media at the time, you can just tell they loved her so much, and her family just had the utmost concern, and they were just doing everything. The concern from the community was palpable, and when a vigil was held outside of her home, it was just more confirmation of the social circle she had built there. 150 people came out and cried alongside Allie's sisters and family. And despite their sadness, they tried to keep hope in the conversation and talked about all the things they loved about Allie, like her delicious red velvet cake she'd make, her potato salad recipe, and her love for gardening. People really wanted to help, and within the first month, rewards were being offered, and they just kept increasing, with one person even anonymously offering a $30,000 reward to Crime Stoppers for information. It seemed like anybody who crossed paths with her wanted to find a way to help. Even the people who owned the restaurants she was a patron to would say, "How can we help find Allie? What can we do? Can we contribute?" Allie attended a church called Christian Heritage Church that had a 4,000-member congregation, and church leadership shared her missing persons flyer out to all church members on their distribution list. Her alma mater, Florida A&M University, did the same thing, sending emails out to current students and alumni. Her family, meanwhile, and friends canvassed with flyers and tried to keep hitting new neighborhoods to discuss her case. Law enforcement was able to get the case showcased on some of the major TV platforms, and a billboard was put up on a local highway, also funded by donations. Still, police didn't have a ton of clues to go on, and what they did have, they were keeping close. By April, they told the public that they had 4 persons of interest in her case, and that they suspected foul play in her disappearance because of the time that had passed and the circumstances. You see, after her miscarriage, Allie had been extremely careful with this pregnancy. She wouldn't drive long distances, she didn't lift heavy things, and she didn't even take the stairs places. This caution didn't match up with any sort of spontaneous disappearance without telling anyone. Police in Tallahassee would not name persons of interest besides her estranged husband, James. However, when it came to James, they said they just couldn't rule him out and that he was, of course, somebody they had to look closely at because of the marital issues and because, you always look at the partner first. But they said that he had been extremely cooperative. James avoided the media at first, but then broke his silence, saying he wanted Allie back more than anything, and that she was carrying his baby who was missing along with her. In the meantime, James moved back into the family home on Lorraine Court. A search team led by a local chapter of Class Kids, which is in memory of Polly Klaas, who was murdered in California in the 90s. They came to do a search deep into national forest territory areas, but that turned up nothing. They actually ended up doing a few different searches, and they were pretty involved with this. That's because they had been invited in by Allie's family, and they even went on to say that they felt so welcomed that Allie's family trusted them with searching for her. Months went on without a sign of Allie. And eventually, her July 18th due date came and went. It was at this time that a bit more about the investigation came out and what timeline they were able to put together for Allie's last movements. But before we get into her final known movements, let's back it up even further to the separation from James. It was discovered during the investigation that during their separation, Allie began seeing someone named Dwight. Her family knew of him but didn't know much about him, other than Allie didn't seem that serious about him. One of Allie's neighbors, who also identified himself as close friends with her, a man named Gary Marone, said that this Dwight guy she was dating was a truck driver, and he described him as a light-skinned black man, muscular with curly hair, and neighbors would see him outside washing Allie's car. By January, Allie's sister said that Allie wanted to focus on reconciling with James, and that the two had begun counseling. She was already planning her baby shower, and she was slated to find out the sex of her baby on Valentine's Day, a little over a week after she disappeared. She felt she was having a girl and already picked out a shade of pink to match in the nursery. When investigators went to her workspace, they found pregnancy books as well as yellow sticky notes with baby name ideas on them, both boy and girl names, all starting with J because she wanted the baby to have the same initials as James. Her sister stated that Allie really loved James and was very protective of him. James said that when Allie approached him about reconciliation, he agreed and said they had to find a way to work it out. He wasn't moving in just yet. He wasn't moving back, but they were taking it slow, working through their marital issues in counseling. In the week leading up to her disappearance, starting with that Monday, coworkers and friends stated that she was in a great mood, she was feeling good about reconciling things with her husband, and she talked about their upcoming counseling appointment that Friday, the 3rd at 9 a.m. That Thursday, the 2nd, Allie was stressed and down when she got to work that day. She told her coworkers that her property had just been reassessed and that the taxes went up significantly, and she just wasn't sure how she was going to be able to afford them. This was definitely not the burden she needed because she was hoping to reduce or eliminate her hours at Publix in the bakery, especially as her pregnancy went on and with the upcoming birth of the baby that summer. At 5 p.m., Allie got off work from the Department of Health and she drove over to her second job at Publix. The drive was treacherous and the area was experiencing severe thunderstorms. That shift started at 6 p.m. Sometime during that shift, she took a break and she gets a couple slices of pizza from Pizza Hut. Work must have been a little on the slower side that night because she also made a couple of phone calls. At one point, she called her supervisor, Karen Freeman, as I mentioned earlier, and the issue she was looking for advice on was the tax issue. At 8:45 p.m., James Gilmore says he receives a call from Allie. She reminds him of the 9 a.m. counseling appointment they're supposed to both attend in the morning, and she tells him she loves him and gets off the phone. At 11 p.m., she gets off of work at Publix, and we know she makes it home because she places the 2 slices of pizza in the refrigerator. Here is the new big clue they released, though, mainly through Allie's family at this time because police wouldn't speak on it. But police told her family that at 12:47 a.m. on that Friday morning, Allie, so think Thursday she gets home from work, now we're in the early morning hours of Friday, that same Friday that she doesn't show up to work, at 12:47 a.m., Allie gets a phone call, but police will not tell them who this phone call is from. Now, neither Allie nor James shows up to that counseling appointment at Friday at 9 a.m. According to James, he overslept and didn't make it. He tried calling Allie at work to apologize, but of course she was not there. He said he later tried calling the house, also without success. James reports that on Saturday he shows up to the residence and sees her car there. He knocks at the door, but nobody answers. He assumes she's just really angry with him for missing the appointment, and he leaves. And then, of course, he finds out on Monday that she's missing. There is just one contradiction to this story, though. A neighbor of Allie's, a man named Dan McGee, said that he saw James's car, and he said he was 90% sure it was his car. He said he saw it there Friday morning at 7:30, and he actually said to himself, "Oh wow, they must be working things out." You might be saying, "Okay, well, James places himself there on Saturday. Any chance Dan was mixing up his days?" No, because he says he saw what he thought to be James's car at 7:30 on Friday when he came out with his daughter to drive her to school. He said that by the time he got back from dropping her off at 8:10 a.m., the car was no longer in the driveway. Also, James places himself at the house on Saturday evening, looking for her when his Saturday morning phone calls went unanswered. Tallahassee police gave James a voice stress test and they said that he had no signs of deception and that he was fully cooperating with the investigation. I will say, just as an observation, if James did this and he was trying to cover it up, showing up to the counseling session would have been the smart move. He looks objectively bad missing the counseling appointment, and that makes him look more suspicious. So that would be an odd choice for him to make. Though if he did have something to do with it, maybe he was not available to be at the counseling session, and then the phone call apologizing is sort of his way of trying to cover and craft a story. It's hard to say, and I'm absolutely certainly not accusing him of anything because police have gone on record to say that they, felt he cooperated. I'm just talking through the details out loud. It's hard to come up with an explanation of the neighbor identifying his car there Friday morning, and I'm unaware of what, if any, alibi police have been able to track down for his time on Friday. Later on, they would speak to one a little bit more, but it's not anything they made really clearly public in the investigation. I'm also surprised that he wouldn't try to make entry on Saturday. I'm sure he had a key, but maybe he thought she was really mad, and so he was just trying to give her the space to cool off. For months, 2 detectives worked the case exclusively, filling 11 binders with interviews and information. However, by the 1-year mark, they were still the lead detectives but had scaled back. They needed the break to come from someone in the community, someone who may have information. At that 1-year mark, the family held a vigil outside her home, which her husband James was tearfully a part of. He said he was about to graduate with his degree, something that his missing wife had pushed him to pursue. He said that the thought of not knowing was the most difficult, as well as living with a cloud of suspicion around him. He said he didn't even realize at first the extent of the suspicion until he went on the internet and began reading comments. He told the Tallahassee Democrat, quote, "I had no idea so many people suspected me. I wouldn't hurt anyone, much less my wife," end quote. For the 1-year anniversary, the paper interviewed the detectives working the case, Tom Maldiz and J.D. Hoover. When asked about the mysterious early morning phone call, Hoover said, quote, "It's certainly important to us, but it doesn't open any doors. It's not the defining moment as to what happened to Allie," end quote. And that's kind of where things stood. And up to this point, Allie's family seemed relatively diplomatic in the way they talked about her husband, James. Again, they're having these vigils at the house. He's part of them. But in March of 2007, things get a little tense out in the open. It was then that a judge ruled that James could be the beneficiary of Allie's assets. Her family was unhappy with that decision and said they planned to appeal. Her sister said, quote, "It's too early to move on and worry about the benefits. We're trying to find Allie, and he's trying to get her benefits. He never assisted with the searches. He doesn't deserve anything, not a dime." James defended himself and said he was doing this to get by because their house had gone into foreclosure. In a letter filed in the foreclosure suit, James stated, "My wife, Allie, is the primary source of income in our home, and her income took care of our mortgage payment. My income in our home is used to supplement hers when taking care of expenses such as utilities, phone, furniture, etc." Allie's family said they offered to help James pay for the house expenses, but he refused. When asked about the family animosity towards him, James said, quote, "I'm just trying to look out for myself and me and Allie's stuff the best I can. They really don't know as much as they might think they know as far as my situation or anything Allie and I did in getting this house." The financial documents showed the assets that James would get would be the value of the Lorraine Court house, valued at $120,000 at that time, a bank account of hers, leave pay from her job at the Florida Department of Health, and her retirement funds, which they didn't have a dollar amount to match with those. And therein lies the issue that Allie's family had, because their whole stance was, if he was truly about just paying the bills, you would take us up on our offer rather than cash out her assets, but you're looking to just get this money. So yeah, pretty messy. In May of 2007, her case was featured in a segment of Dateline, and there police dropped another little breadcrumb. They said that they believed she left the house that night after receiving that phone call, and that she then faced a still unknown fate as she stepped into the night. By June of that year, law enforcement began the new concept of cold case playing cards in prisons, and Allie was featured on them as the 3 of clubs. At the 2-year anniversary of her disappearance, her mother made another plea to the public, saying, quote, "My concern is Allie. Where is Allie? Is she the forgotten one? If there's anyone out there who knows anything, it's okay to remain anonymous, but it's not okay to remain silent." Family and community members criticized law enforcement for not doing more, to which a police spokesperson said they still cared about the case, they were still working it, and, quote, "These cases are very personal regardless of what people think," end quote. They also went on to say that at that point it was considered a cold case because they had exhausted all current avenues, but that they would have other sets of eyes on it periodically to look for anything they missed, and that if new leads came in, they would immediately investigate them. Allie Gilmore's mother spoke out and said that she didn't feel they were getting a thorough investigation and that things had been mishandled. She cited an example of the fact that she currently had all of the items that were found in Allie's car, and she's saying, "Why are they in my house and not stored as evidence?" The police responded to that and said that they had collected pertinent evidence, but that they had returned other items to the family as an act of good faith, since the items were going to be destroyed by a repo company that seized her car in the aftermath of the disappearance. By year 4 of her disappearance, James had not kept up on the house payments. It was foreclosed upon and had new owners. Only one flyer remained posted in her neighborhood. But the people of her neighborhood, who remembered her as the woman who would always bring out leftover dinner plates for them, and all the other people who loved her, they still wondered her fate. Friends and family would talk about how they would see who they thought was Allie all the time out in public, and her sister even approached people. At one point, her coworker thought she saw Allie coming down an escalator at a store with a man, so she yelled out Allie, and the person didn't respond to her but just kind of looked over. At this 4-year mark, it's at this point that we begin to learn a little bit more about the previously ambiguous man Dwight in her life. Dwight's full name is Dwight Aldridge, as first reported on in the Tallahassee Democrat, with whom he granted a brief interview with. Dwight was careful to paint his relationship with Allie as friendship, not a relationship. When they asked him about Allie's disappearance, he said, quote, "I don't know, I can't get into too much detail about what I spoke to police about." When asked when he last spoke to Allie and what her state of mind was like, he said, quote, "It's been so long, I don't remember." He then told the paper he'd need to consult with his attorney before continuing the interview. A few days later, he wrote the paper an email that said he didn't wish to comment any further. Allie's family disagreed with the friendship assessment, and they released an email that shed a whole new light on the situation. Family members said that Dwight and Allie met at a Florida A&M homecoming event in the fall of that of 2005, and that they had developed feelings for one another. In an email Allie sent to her sister Tracy Smith on December 20th, 2005, she said, quote, "Dwight and I still talk about 2 or 3 times a day. We see each other 3 times a week. He's said I changed since I am pregnant. My past miscarriage haunts me every few days. Then, on top of it, all of the paternity issues," end quote. Yes, Allie Gilmore's sister confirmed that Allie was unsure who the father of her unborn baby was. In a November 22nd, 2005 email to her sister, she referenced Dwight going to an ultrasound appointment with her that day. The spotlight of suspicion was definitely shifting more in the direction of Dwight than James, but that's sort of where it all just stayed. At the 5-year mark, Allie's case was handed over to TPD's Major Case Assessment Team, which handles the cold cases. For years, the paper would run anniversary pieces, and slowly the coverage faded. But not in the hearts of those she left behind. They were still thinking of her more than ever, missing her at holidays, and wondering what would have become of Allie and her unborn baby. In 2021, 15 years after Allie Gilmore's disappearance, police for the first time named a suspect in the case. And it was none other than Dwight Aldridge. According to reporting by Katie Kaplan from WCTV News, there were many reasons to lean in the direction of Dwight. But first, they went into a little further detail into why they weren't looking as heavily into James anymore. They said that beyond his continued cooperation throughout the years, they also had evidence to back up his alibi for that time. What alibi that is, they don't say, but just that he has one. In 2021, investigators walked the media through the case again, sharing mostly everything we already know and discussed about earlier in this episode about her last movements. But Lieutenant Mahoney, who worked the case from the beginning, described how it was an eerie feeling that day they arrived at her home. He was a brand new young homicide detective at the time. Her Publix uniform was laid out on her bed, and the sheet had been pulled back as if she had been in her bed. There was also an open pregnancy book on the bed, like she had been doing some reading. According to Lieutenant Mahoney, Allie kept a calendar where she had circled a date of conception on the calendar, and next to it put the initials DA. They believe DA stood for Dwight Aldridge, that she had been with him that night. Dwight had also attended some prenatal appointments with her, and Allie conveyed to family that he seemed excited to be a father. James Gilmore said that Allie opened up to him about the affair during one of their reconciliation counseling appointments, and that even though he knew the paternity of the baby was up in the air, he was committed to getting back with his wife and raising the baby. So at this point, you have to wonder, is this a scenario where she wants to reconcile with her husband, but she has shared with Dwight, yes, you're the father of this baby, I think, but I want to make things work with my husband. And now he's finding out that he's losing her. He's not going to be in the baby's life in the way he thought that he was. And does this influence what happens? Then in 2021, in that same media release, police finally shared that the early morning phone call to Allie came from Dwight. They said that he lied about where he was calling from, saying he admitted to calling her that night, but that he was nowhere near her. He identified where he was, kind of trying to establish an alibi for himself, and the cell phone data refuted this and placed him very close, with his cell phone pinging near her house. So yes, 2006 was a little earlier with the pinging of towers and how that technology worked, but it was enough to place him there. Aldridge had a criminal history prior to meeting Allie Gilmore. He had served 5 years in prison for armed robbery, and he had been released in 2003. Seemingly after getting out of prison, he hasn't re-entered the system, and he even became a nurse in 2020. He still lives in the Florida community. Police hoped that releasing this information would spark conversation in the community and bring forth someone who could give them the missing piece that would help them move forward with an arrest and prosecution in this case. But now another 5 years have passed and that still hasn't come. Allie would be 50 now, and her baby would be 20 years old. Since the day she disappeared, there has never been a single sign of her, no evidence anywhere. And her family is just still waiting. Even though they have a suspect in mind, there still hasn't been any justice, and they just want to know where she can be found. They want to be able to lay her to rest if that's the answer, and they deserve these answers. As of 2026, TPD detective Mark Ray took over the case, and he says that missing persons cases are the toughest for both investigators and family members. And he shared this message, quote, "Basically, a person just vanishes and they have no answers and we have no answers to give them. So we need that one person to come forward that has information that will lead us either to her remains or give us the information that we need to move forward." If you're that person, it's time to do that. And anyone with information about Allie Gilmore's disappearance is asked to call the Big Bend Cold Case Task Force at 850-410-7611. You may also contact the Tallahassee Police Department at 850-891-4200. There is also the anonymous Big Bend Crime Solvers line at 850-574-7477. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, you can help this podcast by leaving a 5-star review on your preferred listening platform and sharing the podcast with a friend. I find that I have been getting a lot of new listeners from Reddit, people just dropping the podcast name. Please continue to do things like that as well. Case suggestions can be sent to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. I typically cover cases that are unsolved and at least 20 years old. And with that, thank you so much for listening, and join me again next Monday.